I call the Honourable David Pack.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I acknowledge the outgoing Speaker, Mary Harris, and thank her for her wonderful efforts through the years. Mr Speaker, I want to talk about the Saudi sheep scandal. One of the things that the New Zealand population relies upon the government to do is to hold up standards of decency, freedom from corruption and fair dealing in the world. Those are very, very important to New Zealand's reputation. Indeed, they're one of the reasons why we secured the Security Council membership that we're just taking up today. And it's with great shame, I think, that Mr McCulley has sullied that reputation through the Saudi sheep scandal that we didn't know anything about until 2 months ago. Now, from his perspective and from John Key's perspective, it's just another deal. That's how they see the world. They've got no standards. They don't see this as being wrong, and that's why they make these fundamental mistakes. What rubbish? Well, we've got the history of the Sky City deal, where they sold casino rights in a secret sort of behind closed doors deal that was criticised by the Auditor General. We had the Warner Brothers deal. We're now living in a country where lobbying and special pleading gets you a special leg up from this government. And nowhere is this worse than in respect of this Saudi sheep scandal. 2 years ago, essentially, the deal was done. The government approved some payout to Mr Khalaf and this so-called model farm in the desert, and yet we heard nothing about it until earlier this year when Minister Guy went to the so-called model farm in the desert and said things that were preposterous, but nonetheless talked it up. In fact, he said, amongst other things, it was going to be a model of the way we do farming. There is no other model farm in the world that the government has funded under this one. And so the media started to pay attention and thought there's something fishy about this, and they started to dig. And it's actually the media that got onto this story before politicians, and I pay my respects to the Fourth Estate because I think they've done a good job in this. Mr Speaker, the next thing that happened was that the $6 million figure paid for this bizarre farm in the desert turned into a higher figure because someone leaked that the sheep had been flown to the other side of the world at the cost of $1 million. And this is when we had the first of the cartoons starting to appear, making a mockery of the government about, last time I'll travel on this line, no deck quoits, no pokie machines, no mahjong, no swimming pool. Mr Speaker, the government was starting to be made fun of because it was just bizarre that we were flying sheep to the other side of the world. Then, the day before this long overdue cabinet paper that the government had hidden since 2013 came out, Mr McCulley said, actually, the total's now $11 million. Now, what was the difference between the 6 and the 11 other than the $1 million that they spent on flights? $4 million payment, which has been unpicked as a facilitation payment to buy off Mr Khalaf. That's called a bribe in other countries. I'm not suggesting that the money went into Mr McCulley's pocket. There is no suggestion of that. But it is wrong of this government to bribe a foreign person who's getting in the way of a free trade agreement. And that's what happened. Now, how have we proved that? We've proved that because initially Mr McCulley in this House blamed the prior Labor government and said we'd left behind a $20 to $30 million legal risk. So the obvious question was, well, why did no one tell us that? Checked with the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, former Ministers of Trade, Foreign Affairs, that's Clark, Cullen, Peters, Gough, Anderton and Sutton. None of them have heard about it because it was an untruth. It was an untruth. And Mr Speaker, we unpicked that. Then Mr McCulley admitted that there was no live legal claim. In fact, none had been filed. Then the Prime Minister admitted there was no clause of action. He admitted that to the NBR, and still the government pretend that this was a payment for good value rather than to get Mr Khalaf out of the way of the Freed Agreement. It was a disgraceful episode, Mr Speaker. Then we had the bizarre thing where the Minister of Agriculture said the 75% lamb losses were caused by a desert storm. Sandstorm, he said. I kid you not. This is a cause of more mirth amongst the media, and we had there's a lot of sand in the desert and the wind can get up and that caused those lambs to die. Yeah, that's what I reckon happened. That's what he said. They were all over the place. On the same day, we had the contractor saying that they died as a consequence of a rain event. Mr. Speaker, this is an outrage.
I call Mark
this
Mitchell.
Is feeding corruption in other countries.
I call Mark Mitchell.